Welcome to the Free Lunch Podcast, an exploration of the interesting themes that define our economic lives.
Hello, everyone. This is our second episode of Free Lunch. Thank you so much for those who are able to listen in on our first episode. This is our second episode where we are carrying on the conversation on the national stimulus package with a focus today on infrastructure. But just before I get into that, I'm curious what you guys thought of our first episode. Thank you for the comments that folks shared. I managed to read some of them, and Ken, one of them actually was targeted to you, and you shared it with us. You know, I was laughing as I read it. This idea that when you were in undergrad, you and your friends would go around looking for opportunities or events or seminars where free lunch was being offered, so then you could listen in. I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot too much, but I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yes, indeed. That got me back on a nostalgia train. And yes, I think one of the ingenious ways that universities, especially in the States, discovered is a good way to attract attention is you want to have session and you want to have free pizza. And typically this free pizza would be over lunchtime. So I'd totally forgotten about that chapter of my life, but it was great when Wanja reminded me of that.
No, that's excellent. So, I was just thinking maybe that's why I'm happy now I didn't go to an Ivy League school. So at least in the school that I went to, we had lunch for nearly all campus students. So as long as you were on the meal plan, you could go eat anytime. And actually, now you're talking about your free pizza, and I'm thinking about how I gained like an extra 15 kilos just because of having food available all around the time. But anyhow, off to different matters to do with infrastructure and the national stimulus. So Ken, what do you think? $50 million allocated by the Kenyan government to infrastructure.
Yeah, that definitely came up in the 8 point plan. And as you said, $50 million or 5 billion shillings was put aside, just to cater for part of road rebuilding, especially after the devastating rains that had come and really ripped apart some of the rural roads. So I think that amount was appreciated in terms of rehabilitating access roads and footbridges and such things. And also the fact that there was that idea that much of the reconstruction will be utilizing local labor. So young labor force, local labor force. I think that was an interesting component. I think just to build up on that also was the Madaraka Day speech the president delivered, which I found rather profound because it's very rare you get a president really journeying you through the economic history of the country. And that's what exactly the president did this time. So he said, from the 78 years before independence, 1885 to about 1963, the country managed to build about 1,800 kilometers of road. And from 1963 to 2013, the 50 years post-independence, the country managed to build about 11,200 kilometers. And his point was he's built in his 7 years presidency, he's managed to build 44 times what the pre-colonial government built and 4 times what the founding fathers built. And I guess that was in a way to invite our listeners to a new perspective on maybe government performance. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on those kind of numbers.
No, very interesting. And, I love to put things in context. Maybe this is because of the work we do in the behavioral sciences, where we love to think about, understanding and decision making is really governed by a couple of things. And two factors are perception and context. So, yes, I like the fact that you drew in, what other governments and the colonial government had done in the past. And, if you think about this in context, like the colonialists weren't necessarily trying to build a road across the country. Like they weren't trying to invest in rail to go to all different corners of Kenya. They were largely trying to think about how to get raw materials from the port in Mombasa for at least from the hinterland and to the port, and then of course expanding through into Uganda and other places within the territory of the Imperial British East Africa Company. So their focus was quite targeted on let's create a way to get raw materials out of the country. So I can understand why the mileage and the air carriage covered by the road and infrastructure system wasn't as high. But also, the president has had a few opportunities and things that have helped him along the way. The fact that the earlier presidents, right from independence, probably didn't have as big an access to the large donors, so either from the Exim Bank in China and other places where they could quickly go get funds to support infrastructure development. Certainly China was nowhere as big as it is now with the Belt and Road Initiative. So there have been a few a few positive factors that have helped his administration sort of push ahead on infrastructure. And even on that, there's a concern, at least in his first term, in terms of who had done more for infrastructure. Was it his predecessor or himself? But, really excited that there's been an emphasis on infrastructure in the stimulus package. Although, to be very honest, behaviorally, when I think I shared this in the first episode, is that, there's a bit of, when I heard it, I was excited. And it seems like I fell for the classic champion bias, right? So where the champion bias basically talks about how you are likely to judge the likelihood of success of an initiative. So building roads and stimulating the economy to grow through road development. You're likely to build your success or the likelihood of success for that based on who's announcing the result, who's the champion, who's driving it forward. So I was excited about, the fact that the president has taken initiative and he's put this on his 8-point plan. And it seems like from the Madaraka Day celebration and speech, we were back to the same thing, right? So the champion is there speaking heavy on, what his administration has done and, trying to create positive momentum and appreciation for everything that the government is looking to do within infrastructure and beyond. So I think that's great. And of course, with everything, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, if you will.
Right. Wow. You've raised a couple of very interesting points in terms of how do you assess performance with previous administrations when variables are fundamentally different. The Kenya of 1885 and the Kenya of 1963 and the Kenya of 2020 are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And this is where definitely economists need to come and sort of how do you give sort of like a measured apples to apples comparison when things have changed fundamentally. That said, one thing that came out to me was the fact that the one area this administration has really focused on has been on roads and electricity connections. In fact, when I was reflecting about it, I was actually thinking, if you're a president, let's say you're President Kim Karaoke, and
right.
you did nothing else but expand the road network and expand electricity connection, and of course maintain law and order. What kind of growth GDP would you expect? And would it be the normal 5%?
Exactly.
that you get. So sometimes I feel, yes, we talk about 5%, but really when you think about the Vision 2030, it spoke to Kenya growing at double digits.
Yeah.
And that's where we need to be. So sometimes I feel like being a president of a developing country, sometimes because you're coming from a base where there's almost nothing, that any continuation of infrastructure is just growth. Right?
Exactly. One more person employed will help push the employment figures and the GDP forward, but not necessarily but of course there are trade-offs to be made, and hindsight is always 2020, right? So you could argue and say, oh, if you did more roads, there's an optimization there that needs to be done, and perhaps going back to central planning, it'd be great if somebody had like this tool of saying like, for every $1 investment in road, your GDP goes up or down, depending. And so you can net off some of the effects.
That's a good one. I think that's a classic one. But I think it's something that we should definitely investigate, especially the part of the local component, because when you look at some of the big projects such as the standard gauge railway, I think one of the criticisms has been it has employed a lot of Chinese labor. And there was supposedly a gentleman's agreement that that workload would be split between local labor and Chinese labor, but it seems China took a big chunk of that. So I think there's a new thinking right now in terms of let's use our local labor, but again, it goes back to the question is, are the skills there? Yes, we have TVET being rolled out. We sent a lot of young people to go study railways abroad. But I think those are some of the issues that we should definitely look at today.
And you've touched on a very salient point, which is this idea of with China's Belt and Road initiative. You get a sense that they're benefiting in two ways. On the one hand, they're bringing their personnel to come and help deliver the infrastructure, which on the one hand is positive. It's helping us overcome challenges that we've had in the past of funds diversion, etc. But on the negative end is some of the things that you're talking about is where is the skills transfer? And great if some of these things can be done on ground, and if we can leverage the skills and expertise coming out of our TVETs so that it can complement the experts' capabilities. But like you've said, those relationships haven't necessarily been quid pro quo. They haven't necessarily been each party is benefiting equally. Just recently, Rwanda kicked 3 Chinese out of its country because of them not necessarily towing the line, not doing things in the right way. And the words used were quite harsh. And Kenya did something similar just before COVID. It just sort of goes to show that there's a lot more that needs to be appreciated when these arrangements are being put into place. And of course, the second aspect of how the Exim Bank would benefit is that this is a grant of some sort or a loan of some sort, so there's some payback expected. And in Kenya's case, it is certainly a loan that the exchequer has to pay. So they're benefiting from bringing their expertise, so they're employing their people, they're bringing their money, and we're paying for it. So you have a scenario where the local economy can very easily get crowded out. And of course, things get worse if they bring their own raw materials. So of course, if they can source steel and cement and other things locally, you're better off. But in places and in countries where that is impossible, then you really wonder how much benefit is being accrued to the local economy.
Indeed. In fact, when you start talking about what happened in Rwanda and some of the incidences that don't always go as planned, and those incidences can be bucketed into many categories. It could be how much labor is being deployed, or what's the financing situation, and even the topic that was on the headlines this week: Kenya drops Chinese contractor for Naivasha Malaba upgrade.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely. What CS Macharia said was that PPP agreement was taking way too long to implement, and they just found a new financier, although they have not mentioned the name, to come and taking up. So the wrong financing, I think, are also fundamental. But I think I like how you raise the Chinese example, because I think China is really the master of infrastructure. What China has done over the last 40 years in terms of infrastructure, I don't know if any country can be able to replicate, and its ability to lift people out of poverty. And a lot of that funding was through state finance, state bank financing, unlike in Kenya where it's private creditors who are putting it. So it makes you wonder, every time Kenya had its own Kenya Development Bank, I saw that was on the news yesterday, in terms of financing infrastructure projects. I don't know what you think.
No, very interesting. You talked about China, and the thing that that gets lost through all of this is there's what China is doing in Africa, but there's also what China has done internally in terms of rapidly modernizing its rural villages, coming up with huge mega cities. If you think about COVID, coming up with, believe they erected a hospital in a week or something like that. It was crazy. Like the level to which they can quickly turn infrastructure projects around is quite amazing. And it goes to speak to a certain level of sophistication that they've come to. And even outside of China itself, they have pipelines that they're using, that they're developing and connecting different parts of Europe to Russia. Like there's a lot of things that the Chinese have been able to do that sort of go understated for one reason or another. But it sort of goes to speak to the fact that they've been able to take that great leap forward that they've always envisioned and are playing at a global stage. But you've mentioned something about the Chinese contractors here, and it's made me think what's likely to happen because of COVID. So already we're seeing a bit of stigma coming up with people who've either recovered or had COVID. And I wonder whether, post-COVID or post-lockdown, once we resume flights, etc., whether African nations that receive the virus largely from China and other places will be as open, as welcoming, as eager to engage with Chinese companies wanting to bring in their own or importing their own labor, especially in this post-crisis environment.
Yeah, that's been one of the big talking points, especially when COVID-19 came starting end of 2019. And I feel like Australia has been the most courageous country. And that question, they said they need to investigate where the origins of the coronavirus was. And that didn't go down very well with the Chinese. And China being Australia's biggest trading partner was quite a brave thing by the Australians, because that can have massive impact on the Australian economy when those kind of diplomatic ties start to weaken. But I guess if you look at what is called the Anglo-Saxon establishment, what they call the Five Eyes, Australia is the closest to China, and I guess it has the mandate. But I think a lot of countries might ask that question. But I always say sometimes the language of dollars and cents is always far more eloquent than the language of diplomacy. And a lot of people will still say, hey, yes, it's China. All these things could have originated. It's hard to know, but what we know is we get cheap products from China and we're able to sell them for a profit. And I think that economic language, the language of economics, is always so powerful.
Right. No, at the end of the day, the almighty dollar or shilling or pound or kwacha, depending on where you are, dictates, how life will be.
No, absolutely. So yes, I hear people saying buy Kenya, build Kenya, which I totally support. But I think a lot of people forget that once all this infrastructure is open and you're back to free market economics, definitely people who have a cheaper supply chain people will always tend to move towards the cheaper supply chain. And China sort of built a monopoly in that. What I wonder is why can't countries like Kenya try to invest in developing that knowledge they get from the Chinese within our local universities and be the China of Africa, really become excellent in infrastructure and start sending Kenyan contractors across Africa because we have a better understanding of Africa. I don't know why that approach has not been looked at, because these are engineering skills that can be taught to anybody. I don't know why we've not invested in that knowledge transfer component.
No, very good comments, Ken. And just before I respond, let me just quickly do a quick shout out to anyone who's joining now. So this is our second podcast episode. This is Kim and Ken. We're talking about the national stimulus package. with a focus on infrastructure. And Ken, you raise a good point on, are we as Kenyans, can Kenya or any other African nation be the Chinese equivalent to help shore up infrastructure development across the continent and elsewhere? And to that point, so anecdotally, I have had it said that a number of, it's only in Kenya, for example, where Kenyan contractors are not the ones building roads. And if you travel to the south, you have a huge population of Kenyan contractors who are actually building mega infrastructure projects. So I wonder whether it's a question of we are not appreciating or rewarding or recognizing or keeping our talent locally. I do know in the early, what is this, must have been in the 80s, in the 90s, we had a number of programs to take Kenyan engineers out of the country, and some of them were coming back from places like Russia and elsewhere. And they were coming to be the road contractors then, and built a fairly large amount of roads in the country. But I think into the 90s, we began to see a bit of a washing out of that. And then as other influences came into play, we sort of slightly then began to realize that it's not as cost effective to have a Kenyan build a Kenyan road for different reasons, whether it was because of fraud or instances of misappropriation of funds, and that other players like India and China, certainly towards the entry of the 21st century, we started having China, India, and others, Japan coming up really strong. They have competitive advantage in that they can source steel and other raw materials and machinery cheaply. So then your same Kenyan contractor who would have to perhaps import a bulldozer, import a mixer, if you sign a contract with a large Japanese consortium that will come in and build the road, they likely are manufacturing those things in country. So then you start finding that, I guess, if you would want to, then the opportunity costs are much, much higher. But I think it requires a purposeful and maybe Pan-African approach to say, hey, let's actually double down and invest on our young people. And pivoting this back maybe to the stimulus package and infrastructure slightly, it's great. And you mentioned this, Ken. You talked about how about 200,000 youth have been engaged through this program, and I think that's the beginning. It's a good start, certainly. However, the framing of all of this was interesting. So, 50 million on the outset sounds really high, but if you start doing the math, if you say, okay, 200,000 youth, each receiving 50 million, each receiving or entitled to this 50 million stimulus package, breaks out to about $250 per laborer, which then, that starts to raise an interesting question. If you assume that they'll be paid the minimum wage, and we can argue what the minimum wage is or what they're paid, but if you assume, okay, if it's somewhere between $135, especially if you go by what's been requested, then that's about 2 months worth of work. But if you say, okay, likely they won't get that $135 per month. Let's say they're really, and because it's part of this is unskilled, let's call it about $50 per month. Then you're looking at 5 months. So then the question I have is that in that 5-month period, or the 2 to 5-month period, could you get skilled and unskilled labor to contribute to a reasonably high efficacy in maintaining roads and bridges that have collapsed, to this extent to which these young people can start building confidence, and this can be a seeding opportunity for further investment or their future in a road and construction career that finally gets us to a place where we are competitive as compared to some of the international players that are in this space. Ken, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Wow, that's a very insightful question, and I hadn't even looked at it from that perspective. And sometimes it makes me wonder is when we get this communication from the office of the president, should we be having sort of this kind of roundtables where these kind of questions are asked, because I find sometimes the communication very one way,
Yeah.
and it's hard to know the scope, especially on infrastructure projects, whether it's the big SGR, whether it's the port of Mombasa,
Yeah.
sort of was that security for a loan, or whether it's how many young people and what's the regional distribution of the young people and how much are each getting. It gets very hard now to be able
Mm.
to answer those questions. So I think I don't know how other countries are, are developing, but I've always wished we could have some economics infrastructure roundtables where
Mm.
sort of like we could really go down into the detail, because it's what the best we can do is do a guesstimate. I like what you said about using the minimum wage. But
Mm.
even then, I mean, we know many entities that don't pay minimum wage. We
Yeah.
know many people, many companies pay their employees below minimum wage legally,
Yeah. Yeah.
because there are all those kinds of gaps. So it makes it hard to give a very clear analysis on the level, but just on the calculations that you've done, even if you're stretching it to 5 months,
Yeah.
yeah, it tells you that perhaps more can be done.
Correct. And to be honest, you've raised such a good point on what's the devil is in the details, and how is this being implemented. So anecdotally, I came across a few interesting things this week that gave me a glimmer of hope. So on the one hand, there was a piece in the daily paper that was talking about how there's an ongoing beautification program within Nairobi, um, to and the contractors are taking advantage of the fact that there's a low footfall, and so they can go ahead and create footpaths. And we're seeing some paving going on, which I thought was really nice. At least once we're back in full swing, pedestrians and others should have places to walk, which is fantastic. Then the same newspaper also captured 2-3 days later the fact that all these paved roads on the main highways are actually being used by vehicles as parking, as garages, as places to hold cars. So then you wonder, like we're investing in the right things, we're upgrading the infrastructure, but then our own sort of self-interest is getting in the way of actually us being able to maximize utility. But on the issue of how is this being implemented, I also came across something interesting where there's a form apparently that you're supposed to, there were guidelines that were issued by the national government on how young people should go about registering for this, which was quite nice. The idea is that you go and you complete an application with your name, your details, and some supporting documentation, and then you take that to your area assistant chief, right? So this then became interesting. So you can imagine, so it doesn't stipulate whether this unskilled laborer is meant to complete this application in duplicate or in triplicate. Are they meant to write it out? Are they meant to print it? So all of that was a bit of a gray area. But then they submitted to the area assistant chief. Now, Ken, if you're like me, you might not know who your area assistant chief is. But I'm using the karaoke heuristic and assuming that there must be an area assistant chief called karaoke. So assuming then I can find this karaoke and submit my documentation. So there are no timelines in terms of when you will actually be told if you've been successful. And I worry then if it boils down to my knowing my area chief, you introduce a whole bunch of barriers and biases into this process. Because if you're my kinsman, then likely I will want to give you the job. If you give me something small to facilitate my processing of quote unquote your application, then you're likely to make it in. um, and that then sort of it creates inefficiency in the system. But the last one that I thought that was a bit sad was there's a line, and I think this was meant well, but it talked about people with disability will be considered for suitability, which I thought was really good. I think it's important to mainstream. But then I wondered if we're talking about building roads, would those people with disabilities get excluded anyway? Because if it's unskilled labor, then would they be able to go out and contribute in the same way? So then I just sort of felt that there's a lot of detail here that we I think things were meant well, but there's some gaps certainly. But that just might be me being nitpicky. I'm curious to hear what you think, Ken.
I love how you brought it down to the micro level and to the community level. And that's, I think, the lens that often we miss when we talk about infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think far too much you talk about how many kilometers have been tarmacked,
Yeah.
but I like it how you bring it to the local level. When I think about this, I remember a trip I took to Baringo about a decade ago,
Mm.
and I remember the roads there were very well tarmacked, and there was very little usage. I could just see a couple of donkeys
Mm-hmm.
on those roads. And it just, I mean, back to your question in terms of how are these things processed at the local level?
Yeah.
Obviously, we know political affiliation has been a big part of infrastructure. You
Yeah.
tend to find places where there's a big political figure, you tend to find the roads are better whether there's usage or not.
Yeah.
And that's a separate question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in terms of how local communities are processing this is these local realities that make you wonder, should we devolve most
Mm.
of these functions to the level that can be accessed? And I do know that they have sort of tiers where they have highways, category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and counties can do category 1, 2, 3, and the rest is for the national administration. And I do know there's that kind of classification, but when you really think about that excellent road in a remote area that's not being used, you
Mm.
ask yourselves, could that budget have gone to smaller access roads along the country
Yeah.
to be able to improve access? And I know you're very passionate about resilience,
Yeah.
and at some point you have to talk about what we consider resilient infrastructure,
Yeah.
because you have to know African societies were there even before colonialism, so
Yes.
there was resilient infrastructure that was there. And how can we map our infrastructure budget
Mm.
and the talent that goes into fixing that infrastructure into really feeding resilient infrastructure? I think that's the question we've not asked as a country. And that's why you find these some disconnects, whether it's in how the things are being processed or who's being allocated or the quality of work being done.
Yeah.
Sometimes you find that's the origin of those disconnects.
And I like what you talked about, that issue of resilient infrastructure. And it's made me think of my road to my rural home. And we take quite a bit of pride as a family in thinking that our grandfather actually spent time carving out that road when he was a young man. So at that point, that was properly unskilled labor, right? Like that wasn't, there was no Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. That was him and a few people hacking away at the bush to create a path from the road that existed to the house. And when you think of these 200,000 youth, I would love a scenario where these youth come in fairly unskilled, untrained. They get absorbed into the young people program that the government is calling Kazi Mtaani, or work in the town. And then they would get up to a point where they finish that first job, then get listed onto a database somewhere of people who have been pre-qualified as folks who can deliver infrastructure support, bridge support services to the Kenyan government or to a county, and then they can be doing the county roads, etc. That then finally they could qualify for credit to even purchase a small machine that they use on a rent share basis, whether it's a leveler or it's a bulldozer or a grader of some sort. And then they could perhaps get to a place where they can now move from being a sole entrepreneur to hiring 2 or 3 staff, maybe from TVET or other places. They could get fast track qualification for national tenders to deliver roads. And then for more, and in this sort of small scale but organic way, you start having your large consortiums of private sector developers who can do work for Kenya and within the region and outside even of the region into the continent and elsewhere. And I think resilience requires some pre-planning. So in the early days when it was my grandfather and his siblings and age mates. Their parents' resilience plan was, I will feed you, go build and carve out the road, right? But now, can we get our young people to a place where they have not only the skills and the expertise, but their confidence grows, that they become the next large scale contractors. And who knows, maybe they then end up opening up Africa's Belt and Road Initiative, right? And so they are the ones going around building roads, building bridges, building airports. And I couldn't agree with you more on the piece that you talked about, how a lot of these infrastructure developments ended up being very mainstreamed with your political affiliation. In fact, in many instances, it was a reward of voting in a certain way and electing a certain person or people into government. So it'd be nice to decouple, the politics and actually really create grassroots solutions that will last us during COVID and also beyond.
Absolutely. I think you're preaching to the choir here. I completely
Mm,
agree. And when I talk to young people, they're very excited about going to the counties and being part of these grassroots initiatives. The only
mm,
problem is when the reality of payments starts coming in.
yeah,
County governments tend to delay payments for very, very long. Sometimes the payments follow, as you even pointed out, a political angle. So you find a young guy is very keen on transforming his county, goes and starts his company, bids for a job, wins it,
yeah,
goes and a loan from a local commercial bank, gets the loan, starts doing the Maram or the tarmac road,
right.
and by the time he's taking his certificate of completion, he's told you have to wait for the pay, and sometimes they're told the county has no money,
Yeah,
and you have to wait till next year. But the problem is that young man and that young woman borrowed from a bank,
yeah,
and the bank might not be as accommodating
yeah.
as they would want it to be. So what we saw, especially in counties such as Machakos, for example, there were a lot of cases of people being auctioned off,
Mm,
because of they had spent a lot of their fortune, they have not been paid, the
mm,
county governments are not releasing this money. So we realize the financing part is such an important aspect to quality infrastructure. And I've seen people even really thinking out of the box. And one thing I like
mm,
about Kenya is there's a lot of innovation. And some people were saying when this young man finishes it and he gets the certificate of completion,
right.
why don't you implement a blockchain solution such as Ethereum,
Mm-hmm,
where you have what they call smart contracts, where
mm-hmm,
payment is really triggered upon showing the certificate of completion? There's no human interface. So
correct.
you really take your certificate of completion, it's an smart contract, and it just triggers a payment into your account. And I found that so interesting that this kind of solutions exist. And
Yeah.
for me, I think if we can push the dial towards that kind of thinking, I think it's something that can really, really transform infrastructure development in Kenya.
I fully agree with you, and I echo your words. Totally preaching to the choir. And I know we are coming up onto the 35-minute mark. It could be time for parting shots, but let me just quickly respond to what you said. I totally agree with you that it would be great if we could think about innovative solutions. And fundamentally, we would need to also really make sure that all the actors are aligned. So whether we're talking about blockchain or we're talking about using other solutions, it would be important to make sure that everyone within the ecosystem is behind the solution or the intervention. Others, what you have is people creating friction and shooting down the ideas, and then we get nowhere. Or you have a situation where people just switch off, and a good initiative that really would have transformed the lives of people ends up not being adopted or scaled. So a really good example on that related to transport is paying for your bus ticket in Kenya via mobile money. Implementers had tried coming up with different solutions, had tried doing it in different ways. Nothing happened. and some of the solutions got sabotaged and just sort of stalled. When last week, at least I think beginning to circle through the media last week, was this idea of, hey, can we actually bring back digital payments for transport? And this was actually being called for by the National Public Service Transport Association. So it just goes to show that it seems like the ideas could be there, they could be right, they could be ready, but the market really has to pull for them. Otherwise, you end up in this scenario where you're pushing things and there's no quick demand. But Ken, I think we are nearly out of time, so I don't want to drag this on and on. Parting shots, what do you think?
Oh, I think you've raised that beautiful topic of NTSA banning the use of cash for matatu fares, and I hope it's a topic we can definitely explore in a future episode. I think it's a very loaded topic with a lot of implications. I think when it comes to infrastructure, yes, there is what we call the primary sort of rail and road, but I think there are all these auxiliary things around addressing systems.
Yeah.
How can we use infrastructure to anchor our addressing system, which can sort of amplify our e-commerce transaction? You know, you lived in the state scheme, and you know how the addressing system really unlocks the e-commerce potential.
Correct.
We don't have that in Kenya. I don't even know the address, the numerical address of the place I'm living in right now. So I think these are sort of like the auxiliaries around infrastructure that hopefully also needs to be fleshed out.
Correct. No, I couldn't agree with you more. Just before I end, I was going to also sort of share something anecdotally. That's reminded me of when I traveled to one of our regional countries, and we were trying to get directions of a particular place, and we got to a point where we were completely stuck, and again, because of lack of addressing. And this was also before ground mapping and GIS solutions had really taken off. So you couldn't necessarily rely on Google Maps, for example. And as we were sitting here looking stuck and trying to figure out our next step, we asked an individual, hey, how do we get to this particular place? And he tried his best to give us his directions, and we were still not getting it. And finally, he looked at us point blankly and said, do you see the cow in the distance? And we're like, yes, we can barely make out something that looks like a cow. And he said, yes, that is a cow. Get up to the cow and do not pass the cow. And before you pass the cow, take a left and you'll be where you need to go. And, that was crazy. I mean, it worked. I love the heuristic because it saved us a huge amount of time. But, reflecting on it, I couldn't help but think, geez, what happens if the cow crosses the street? What happens if it wasn't a cow? What if there were two cows? You know what I mean? We really do need to get a bit more sophisticated. But in fairness, that was a couple of years back. Now, things are much, much better. But I couldn't agree with you more. Like there's much more that we need to dig into on infrastructure. I'm really keen on this idea of what you said, resilient infrastructure, so that whatever we set up now can be a seed for the future. And with that, I think we can close. Ken, I'm happy for you to do the closing this time. I always feel like my attempts to close end up being not very convincing, or I trigger new thoughts in my head. So let me let you close us off for this one.
Well, I was just going to ask you, why did the cow cross the road?
Yes.
Would be a bad joke, but I think this has been such an interesting take on infra, and definitely linking it to the overall stimulus package and to what you talk about, the addressing system and the role of technology in unlocking infrastructure. I think that's such a powerful theme that will definitely need many sessions to unpack. Thank you so much for listening. Once again, feel free to share your comments on our social media pages. If there's any interesting topics you'd like us to look at, any interesting angles, feel free to reach us out on our social media handles, and we look forward to welcoming you next week. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you so much, everyone. Have yourselves a lovely rest of the day. Stay safe, keep well, and enjoy your free lunch.
Bye.
Bye.